So I know that it's hard to stand in the way between many brilliant minds and caffeination, re-energization in the afternoon. So I'll try to be as concise as I can. So I wanted to, so my background is I worked in industry for about 10 years at Google. And then I went to Oxford to study the ethics of persuasive technology and the attention economy. And now I kind of continue to do work in that area, but broadly in kind of ethics of technology generally. And what I wanted to talk about a bit was just kind of offer three themes that I think could be helpful additions to these conversations that relate not so much to the technologies of AI themselves, but to our expectations for them. And so to do that, I wanted to start with a story, a historical story. 93 years ago this month in Moscow, there was a dinner that was held where around 50 of the most prominent Soviet authors met to have dinner with Joseph Stalin. And the dinner proceeded normally enough. You know, wine was served, food was served. The writers gave their speeches, and then finally it was Stalin's turn to speak to the writers. And just before this, the week before, all the independent writers groups in the country had been basically disbanded and basically coalesced into one writer group, the official state writers group. So Stalin got up to speak, and he said that he thanked the writers for their dedication to their art and their craft. He promised to found a writer's town, a writer's colony. He actually asked them to write more plays and fewer novels so that workers would have time to read them. And then he sat down, but then unexpectedly he stood back up. And he said, there's one more thing. I want to tell you something about what you produce. Because, you know, we have many products that we make, tanks, artillery, weapons, but you also produce something. You produce the souls of people, very important production. And he said, man is reworked by life itself, but you will also rework man's soul. So I toast to you, the engineers of human souls. And this was a striking phrase, and it was probably the main historical significance of that evening. He didn't come up with this phrase. This phrase was coined by the writer Yuri Ilyusha, who used it as a way to talk about the potential for writers to elevate the spirit of man, to nourish the self, to expand our sense of who we are, what the world is, what's possible. But what Stalin was doing that evening, he was turning it around. He was co-opting it, commandeering it for his own ideological ends. What he meant by that phrase that night was that from that point on, those writers' job would be to serve in the interests of the state, and specifically the ideology of socialist realism, which was the general ideology that the point of art is to show an idealized version of life in the Soviet socialist society. And so he was kind of commandeering this high art for very low ends. He was taking something transcendent and making it petty. He was instrumentalizing it. And so his use of the word soul here, I think, you know, it's certainly, obviously not the theological sense of soul, not the one's eternal soul, but it's not purely figurative either. It's not just a metaphor. It has to do with that inner core of us. And I think, you know, we have certain terms in our own time that kind of relate to this or kind of have the same rhetorical effect, the self, the psyche, consciousness. But I think conceptually, I would argue that the closest term that we have that's operative today is the term attention, because attention is, you know, this place where all these different considerations of our life come. It's like kind of one point of negotiation. It's kind of the structure of our agency, of our will. It's something that allows us to speak in a common language across many different kinds of systems in our lives. And so I think if Stalin were giving this talk today, he wouldn't say engineers of the human soul, he would say engineers of human attention. But obviously, if he were giving the talk today, he wouldn't be talking to writers either. He would be talking to creators of technologies, the people who run tech companies, those who create these systems, which are unprecedented in human history, really, that shape, you know, the majority of our waking life is spent with these systems, and it shapes us, our interaction with the world, in more fundamentally than anything else in the world today. So I think that, you know, the big takeaway I'd like you to take from what I say here is that I think we need to up-level the way we talk about all this stuff. I think when we keep talking about these things as technologies, which they are tools, they are technologies. If we keep it only at that level, it limits what we can do. I think we need to get to a place with all this where we talk about this stuff as art, right? I recall, Thomas Aquinas had this phrase for art. Flannery O'Connor quoted it later on. Art is reason in making. And I think that's not a bad description of what's happening with kind of, the development of AI at the moment. It's our collective reason in making in a way. And so basically, like I think that we need to get to where technology criticism is. We think of it in the sense of literary criticism or art criticism, and not just because it's not purely a rhetorical shift, because this allows us to hold it to higher standards. Like we don't have a standard of literature or high art or the equivalent of it for the world of technology today. It's not enough to keep this at the level of psychological well-being, for instance, or so I think we're getting at something much more fundamental here. So that's kind of the big thing I would throw out there for consideration. I don't have answers to this. I think I'm trying to figure out the right questions even. But so what I wanted to do is just kind of say on that kind of general point of this story, I think touches on three themes: and ideology, attention, and language that I think are very important for successful navigation of these conversations and hopefully successful outcomes of the way that we can help move the domain of digital technology forward. So the first of those three things, ideology. So I think, this kind of touches on a few comments that have been mentioned here today. Stalin had an ideology that he was putting, the art of those writers in service of. I think today we often think that there's no real ideology that is, that these new tools, this art is being instrumentalized toward. But I don't think that's correct. I think, if he had socialist realism, I've started to think of this ideology, it's kind of implicit, but not always. This ideology, I think of it as cybernetic realism. And this essentially involves the application of cybernetic concepts and metaphors to the whole world and to ourselves as the kind of primary lens through which we understand it. And when we stop understanding it as a metaphor, then that's when it begins to take its real hold and become a real problem. So, for instance, it would involve seeing people as fundamentally information processors, which we are in some description, but not ultimately, not in the fundamental sense. It's an ideology that sees information as ontologically primary. It sees every problem as in principle an optimization problem. It sees efficiency as a primary good. And so this would involve things like functionalism, the idea that seeing what makes something that it is what the function it performs in the system. So systems thinking is kind of an outcrop of, and again, I'm not saying that these things are bad in themselves. It's just that when they're pulled over us as the entirety of human life, and where we cease to understand their limitations or recognize that there are limitations, that's when it's a problem. So reductionism, so the idea that we can understand anything by breaking it down to its smallest components. And then, informationalism, the idea that that information is primary. And so when we apply this to human beings, this gives us the metaphor of the human as computer. And that's useful in some ways, but if we take that too far, then it can be extraordinarily limiting, obviously. And then we apply that in reverse to machines, and we get sort of gratuitous personification of things that shouldn't really be personified. And then when we apply that to larger scales of organization, we get things like centralization of power, managerialism, and then the technocratic paradigm, as opposed to, for instance, like Ivan Illich's idea of the restoration of the vernacular, the bottoms-up mode of doing things. And so I'll skip past this part in the interest of time. So that's the question of ideology. So I do think there is an ideology there, and I don't think cybernetic realism is the probably ultimate right name for it, but it's the name that I have found useful in thinking through it. The second, after ideology, is attention. And so, I think that this idea of attention as being the core of who we are is something that is timely, but it's also very ancient. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. I think the Dhammapada says, like, all that we are is a result of all we have thought. There's a very long, rich tradition of thinking of attention as in a very real sense who we are. And I think it's also, a way for us to understand the basis of the human will and agency. William James called attention, the effort of attention, the essential phenomenon of will. And so, if our attention is being undermined, then, and our attention is our will, then that has enormous implications for the success of our own lives, as well as the collective will, politically speaking. So I think attention is important to understand here as well in this domain is the concept, object of manipulation and competition, of course, the attention economy, which, and all the various effects that proceed from that. One term that hasn't really been mentioned here much, but I think I'll just say the word, so it's said advertising. I think this is a very important thing to take issue with. We're looking for big topics that are theorized, under-researched in terms of what they even are, what they're about. We don't really have a good definition of advertising anymore. It could just be that, like that South Park episode, that everything is an ad. It is just sort of like it's all persuasive design. But I think that the place of advertising in all of this, I think, is a key piece of the question. And there's a sort of like pattern too, where even if a company doesn't start as an advertising company, there's this inevitable drift that way. In the same way, a streaming service, you start by paying a subscription, but then, well, there's this attention there to be monetized, and we undervalue attention. So let's just grab it and then put ads on a subscription service. Or Uber now, like I think there was a conference, some kind of conference, and like their slogan was Uber is attention or something like that. So it's monetizing the attention of riders and cars. So part of it is that there is this continual need to grab attention, and part of it is that there's not a sort of more structural, respect for attention that we've put in place as a society. So then I think there's another view of attention that you could look at it as a form of work or labor, right? If we're living in an attention economy and we're being sort of undercompensated for our attention, or even harmed on the whole, it's kind of, we're workers that are being paid an unfair wage for our attention. And so, the historical kind of response to that would be collectivization and various kinds of demands. So I think that's a useful way of thinking about attention as well. I had some other things on the kind of qualities needed for the future when it comes to attention, but I think I'll skip past those as well in terms of time. So finally, language, and this is kind of one of my big bugbears, actually. So, you can't fix a problem or even move towards fixing it if we can't talk about it clearly. And I think we were talking about this earlier, like the domain of digital technology is actually an ontological morass. There's a real vagueness that is sometimes accidental, but sometimes by design. And it seems to me that a prerequisite for doing anything clearly is talking about it clearly. So like just as an example, so social media, like I've always I never liked this term, but it sort of has been an annoyance rather than something, really serious. But, I was advising a study by a major research group that was on social media, the effects of social media on young people. And the meetings all started going. And then I said, well, what do we mean by social media? And nobody could give any kind of definition of it. I can't think of any other field where we would be content to proceed forward on the basis of such vague categories. We can imagine doing this in medicine or other kinds of engineering. This doesn't seem, it seems just crazy to me. And also it's just not accurate to what they are. So, you could call them attention merchants, attention drills, or whatever. But even by their own definition, they're not social media companies. So on August 6th, there was a Meta made a filing with the FTC. They argued in their own filing that they are not a social media company. And the reason was because the amount of time users spend consuming content from their friends, their connections, on Instagram, it's only 7%. On Facebook, it's only 17%. So they only spend 7% of their time actually consuming content from people that they know. The rest is videos or whatever by celebrities. And so some of this gets to the sort of like the power of influential nodes and frictionless networks, like Jaron was saying earlier. But so it's just not accurate to what they actually are. And so again, I'm not sure in what field we would actually just continue accepting this. So there's a kind of, it's not a disrespect for language, but it's a kind of okayness with vague, loose language. And obviously, sometimes this is because there's a hype value in it. There's a certain set of terms I call paradigm grift sometimes. But they're kind of like linguistic pump and dump schemes where just if you can type something up enough using a term, then enough people will sort of just be okay with the vagueness. But it just seems to me this is like, if we respect language at all, that this is something that I think we could push on. And I don't think this is just a pedantic point. I think it's not just like, oh, I don't like this term. It's sort of, it's like a root level denial of permissions at the level of our language. Because I mean, what it does is it diffuses our attention. And I think the term AI is kind of one of these terms where, you know, we could talk about machine learning, we could talk about certain kinds of AI, but AI as a whole, like, I mean, we have to then clarify what do we mean exactly. But like, there's almost a kind of, I wonder, like reverse Tower of Babel thing where it's like, you know, it's like the builders of the tower are kind of confusing the language of the regulators that want to regulate the building codes of it so that they can just keep building it. So the more that we have to kind of navigate the vagueness of these terms, it seems like the less we're actually able to muster the kind of agential and collective resources to move forward with doing something about it. So that perfect timing. So just to recap then, so these kind of three things were ideology that I've been calling cybernetic realism that sits behind much of kind of the way in which technology is talked about and ourselves. Attention, I think reaffirming that as primacy of attention, and then giving clear, focused attention to the language that we use and why we use it and what we want it to do for us. I think to me, these three things seem extremely important in the context of these discussions about AI, which I'm very happy to have been invited to today to speak about. Thank you very much.